My stepson spread harmful lies about my daughter, so I cut off his college funding and asked him to leave. It might sound harsh, but after what he did, I couldn't let it slide. Now I'm stuck in a messy family situation, trying to make sense of everything. I'm posting here in hopes of getting some advice or perspective. The tension between my daughter and my stepson has been tearing our home apart, and it's putting a serious strain on my marriage. I'm a 49-year-old man, married to my wife, Kira, who's 46. We've been together for 4 years. Kira has a 20-year-old son, Jill, from a previous marriage, while I have a 15-year-old daughter, Ellie, from my first marriage. Ellie's mother passed away in a tragic accident when she was just 7. Since then, it's just been the two of us. I raised her on my own until I met Kira, who had been divorced for a while. We found comfort in each other and decided to build a new life together. What no one really warns you about is just how hard it can be to bring together two kids who aren't used to sharing their parents. We expected some challenges blending our families, but things got far worse than we ever imagined. When we first introduced our kids, Ellie was sweet and welcoming. She was excited to have Kira in our lives, and the two of them bonded quickly. I think she missed having a mother figure around, and Kira stepped into that role with kindness and warmth. Jill, on the other hand, was a different story. I'm not trying to draw comparisons, but while Ellie was still young and eager to connect, Jill was a full-blown teenager and completely uninterested in the whole situation. He made it clear he didn't care about his mom's new relationship. Kira blamed his attitude on her ex-husband but reassured me that Jill was a good kid deep down and just needed time to adjust. After we tied the knot, Kira and Jill moved into my house. Jill didn't complain. He went from a tiny apartment to a big house where he had his own room and space. Ellie wasn't exactly over the moon, but she didn't mind having a new sibling either. I figured if nothing else, mutual tolerance would be enough to make things work. At first, Jill and Ellie were distant but civil, which felt like a win. I assumed things would warm up over time, but slowly Jill's behavior shifted. He started making backhanded remarks about Ellie's appearance and teasing her in ways that didn't feel innocent. Ellie usually kept quiet, sometimes snapping back, but it was clear she couldn't match his cruelty. Every time he said something hurtful, I could see a little more of her confidence crumble. At first, Kira and I dismissed it as the usual teenage bickering. But when we saw how deeply it was affecting Ellie, we stepped in. That didn't sit well with Jill. He resented being called out and acted like we were taking sides. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, thinking he was struggling with the adjustment. Maybe he didn't know how to be a big brother, and maybe Ellie was having trouble accepting him too. I hoped, naively, that it would all settle down in time. However, once Ellie entered her teenage years, she stopped putting up with Jill's nonsense and began standing up for herself. What followed were constant clashes. They argued endlessly, bickering over even the smallest things. Kira and I did our best to calm things down, but it was exhausting constantly playing referee between them. I kept thinking that once Jill left for college, things would improve. Unfortunately, that hope was crushed when Jill decided to attend a college nearby, meaning he stayed at home instead of moving into a dorm. I encouraged him to get a part-time job since he'd have plenty of free time in the evenings and on weekends, but Jill had no interest in working. He preferred doing absolutely nothing. As a result, the tension between him and Ellie continued to grow. The real breaking point came about a year ago. Jill made a mean-spirited remark about one of Ellie's friends who had come over. Ellie felt deeply embarrassed. She demanded that Jill apologize, but he refused and instead threw a cruel, fat-shaming comment at Ellie. Turned into a massive fight. Kira was home at the time and tried to intervene, urging Jill to apologize. But he stormed out of the house in anger. Kira apologized to Ellie and her friend, but the damage was already done. It wasn't enough for either of them. Later, when I got home, Kira filled me in and suggested therapy or at least family counseling. Jill dismissed the idea, saying he wasn't crazy. Kira ended up grounding him and cutting off his allowance, which basically forced him to come with us to the sessions. Of course, counseling only helps when someone actually wants to change. The only silver lining was that the therapy helped Kira and Ellie grow closer again, as Ellie had been drifting away from her over all the issues with Jill. Incidents like this have become a pattern over the years. Kira and I have tried everything to bring peace between them, but nothing ever sticks. It became clear this tension would only ease once one of them moved out. That's why I had pinned my hopes on Jill leaving for college. But sadly, that didn't happen. I've never been the kind of man to force my stepson to work the moment he turns 18. But now we're just counting the days until he finishes college, gets a job, and finally moves out. But then last week, Jill crossed a line that made me seriously question my choice to bring him into Ellie's life. Both kids attend the same tennis academy. It's actually how Kira and I met during one of their matches. Jill's a bit more advanced than Ellie, though both are very talented in their divisions. Recently, Jill has been making Ellie's life miserable at the academy. He's been spreading silly rumors about her. Most were just childish and annoying, but the latest one went way too far. Ellie came home from practice in tears, ran straight to her room, and locked the door. She refused to speak to anyone and even skipped school the next day, which is completely out of character for her. We tried to ask Jill about it since he had been there too, but his smug, self-satisfied attitude set off alarm bells in my head. I didn't like the way he acted. There was something really unsettling about it. I left for work thinking maybe Ellie just needed some time and space to work through whatever had happened. When I returned that evening, I glanced through the window to check on Ellie. She was still in her room, scribbling something into her notepad, completely isolated. She refused to eat dinner or speak to anyone. Kira and I were deeply worried, but we decided to give her space for the moment. During dinner, Kira brought up Ellie's sudden change in behavior and asked Jill if he knew what might be going on, especially since she'd come back from tennis practice acting this way. He immediately denied any knowledge. But then I caught him smirking across the table, and right then I knew he was involved somehow. I looked at him firmly and asked, "What's going on, Jill? You know something, don't you? You better not have anything to do with this." "Oh, it's just a bit of harmless fun," he replied, his voice thick with smugness. That smug tone made my blood boil. He was clearly trying to make it seem like Ellie was blowing things out of proportion. Kira jumped in immediately, demanding, "What kind of fun, exactly?" Jill just shrugged and leaned back in his chair. "Just some gossip. No big deal." That set Kira off. She leaned forward, nearly slamming her hands on the table. "Tell us, what did you do?" Jill went on the defensive, acting irritated. "Why do you guys always overreact? She's the one being dramatic. Why don't you ask your little snowflake baby?" That's when I stepped in, telling him to watch his language and tone. He pushed back from the table mid-meal and stormed out of the house. I got up shortly after and gently knocked on Ellie's door. She must have overheard everything because this time, she opened it. She was curled up on the couch, clearly distressed. "I know Jill's involved," I said gently. "Please tell me what happened." Her face turned red with embarrassment, and she began to cry. Kira came in, sat beside her, and wrapped her arms around her. Through her sobs, Ellie finally told us what had happened. Jill had started a rumor at tennis class that she had a crush on her coach and was flirting with him to get more time on the court. The coach apparently is about 6 feet 4 inches, and Ellie is nearly a foot shorter, so it became a running joke. Other students had started mocking her, saying she was trying to seduce an older, towering man. Ellie explained that she wasn't flirting. She just treated him with basic respect, unlike some of the others. Ellie is a quiet, hard-working girl, never one to seek attention. She avoids drama, and Jill had dragged her right into the middle of it, publicly humiliating her. The air in the room turned heavy with anger and sadness. I felt a rush of guilt and heartbreak seeing her that way. I wanted to pull her close and shield her from the cruelty she'd just faced. But while we were trying to console her and figure out what to do, Jill had been eavesdropping the entire time. Suddenly, he appeared in the doorway, laughing cruelly. Kira jumped up and snapped, "What is wrong with you? This isn't funny. Why would you do that?" Still chuckling, Jill smirked and said, "Come on, it's a joke. Everyone's talking about it now. It's hilarious." That was the last straw. I was on the verge of losing control. I yelled, "Get out. Now, you've gone way too far. You'll be dealing with the fallout, believe me." He tried to protest, but I cut him off and shouted again, demanding he leave. Then I turned to Kira and quietly asked her to give Ellie and me some space. She nodded and stepped out. I wrapped Ellie in a hug and apologized sincerely for everything she had endured because I brought that boy into our home. She reassured me that none of this was my fault, that the blame fell squarely on him. Still, I couldn't shake the guilt for putting her in such a toxic situation. I'm incredibly lucky to have a daughter like her. Honestly, how many teenagers do you know who don't point fingers at their parents when things fall apart with a step-sibling? She's been nothing but understanding. I sat her down, made sure she ate something, and promised her that I would set things right. Later that night, I went back to our room and had a serious conversation with Kira. She was visibly upset about what Ellie had gone through. We both agreed it was time to deal with Jill head-on. This wasn't harmless bickering anymore. It had crossed into bullying territory, and I wasn't about to tolerate that in my house. The next day, Kira confronted Jill while I sat beside her. "What you did to Ellie was cruel," she told him firmly. "It wasn't a joke. You owe her an apology, and you need to come clean about spreading that rumor. This can't happen again." Jill looked at us like we were insane, as if I'd brainwashed his mother into siding with me. "I'm not apologizing for a joke," he snapped. "If she's too sensitive to handle it, that's not my fault. And I'm not taking it back." I could feel the anger bubbling in my chest. This wasn't just immaturity, it was malicious. I had been footing the bill for everything in his life since I married his mom. His college tuition, tennis coaching, living expenses. I treated him like my own. And this was how he repaid us? I looked him in the eye and said, "If you don't apologize, there will be consequences." He scoffed. "Like what? You'll ground me?" I calmly responded, "No, I'll stop paying for your tuition." That stopped him in his tracks. His smug expression faded. "You can't do that," he said, looking at Kira. "Mom won't let you." Kira was caught off guard by my declaration, but she backed me up. "This went way too far, Jill. If you want things to go back to normal, you need to take responsibility." Still, Jill stormed off, slamming the door behind him like a child throwing a tantrum. Kira turned to me afterward, her face full of concern. "You weren't serious about cutting him off, right?" I told her I absolutely was. If he refused to make things right, then I wouldn't fund his education. She was worried, afraid that cutting him off might ruin his future. I simply said, "Then he should think about that before choosing to be cruel." She didn't respond. I think deep down she knows he won't apologize. He's too prideful to admit fault. I didn't tell her this, but truthfully, I think paying for his college is a waste. He's not serious about it. He drags his feet through every course, and he's already behind. 4 years just to finish high school, and 2 years into college with barely any credits to show. He's not using the opportunity. He's hiding from responsibility. I want to teach him a lesson, but I don't have many tools left. Cutting off tuition or charging him rent might be my only cards. Still, I worry about how this might strain my marriage. Is there a better long-term solution to deal with someone so spiteful and manipulative? I'm open to any advice. I just want peace in my home again. Blending families is never easy. And with Jill, things had clearly gone beyond typical sibling friction. What he did to Ellie wasn't just immature, it was cruel. After what happened, I stayed true to my promise and stopped funding his college education. Jill showed no remorse for how he had treated Ellie. In fact, things got worse. Ellie was so humiliated by the rumor he spread that she ended up quitting tennis entirely, something she had been passionate about for years. I told Kira that if we didn't take Jill's behavior seriously, it was only going to escalate. But her hands were tied. He had grown completely unmanageable. He assumed my threat was empty, that I'd eventually cave and pay just like always. But I didn't. When the next semester's fees came due, I ignored the constant reminders from his college. Then, the day before the payment deadline, Jill approached me, acting like nothing had happened. "Hey man," he said with zero respect, "when are you going to pay my tuition? The finance guy won't stop chasing me." Yes, that was literally how he spoke to me. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Watch your tone. Speak to me like that again and you'll regret it. And no, I'm not paying another dime until you take accountability and apologize to Ellie. I honestly thought that hitting him where it hurt, his education, would force him to reflect, maybe even grow up. But no. He scoffed and said, "You really think this is going to make me say sorry?" And then stormed out. The next thing I knew, he had dropped out of college altogether. Kira was devastated. She blamed herself, saying she should have stepped in earlier and just paid the fees. Right until the deadline, she assumed I'd change my mind, but when she saw that I was serious, she tried to help. She didn't have the money lying around, so she was willing to dip into her savings. She even went to the administration office to ask for an extension. But Jill had already submitted his withdrawal forms and spoken to his advisor. To make things worse, he turned on Kira, accusing her of abandoning him and taking my side. He painted himself as the victim and said she was prioritizing me and Ellie over him. Despite all of this, Jill still stayed under our roof, living off of us as if nothing had changed. Kira doesn't make a lot. Before we met, she was working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on and support her son. After we got married, I told her she didn't need to overwork herself anymore and could drop down to 1 job if she wanted, which she did. But seeing everything she sacrificed, it was disheartening to watch Jill treat her with such entitlement. Kira was heartbroken over Jill's choices. She tried to talk sense into him, begging him to apologize to Ellie and go back to school the following term. But he wouldn't budge. Instead, he dug his heels in and became even more stubborn. After dropping out, his behavior spiraled. He spent his time lounging around the house, glued to video games or out with friends, doing everything except looking for work or showing any sense of responsibility. What shocked me the most was that he didn't even attempt to explore ways to fund his education independently. He just quit, as if it meant nothing. It was the start of one poor decision after another. Resentment started to build in me. I had provided him with so much: a stable home, access to education, opportunities others would kill for, and he had discarded it all over misplaced pride. After watching him laze around for weeks, I finally had a serious talk with Kira. I told her that Jill needed a reality check. He had never taken his studies seriously, which explained why losing his tuition didn't seem to faze him. The following day, we both sat him down. I told him, "If you're choosing not to go to college, then you need to start working. You can't just live here doing nothing while we foot the bill." He barely looked up from his phone and mumbled, "I'm working on it." I snapped back, "No, you're not. You're sitting around hoping I'll hand you more cash. That's not going to happen." He sighed and rolled his eyes. "Whatever. I'll just start a business. I just need a loan." I blinked at him in disbelief. "You seriously expect me to hand you money to start a business after all of this?" Without missing a beat, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Yeah, why not?" I had tried talking to him. I had tried being supportive. But he had zero respect for me or the effort we had put into helping him. That was my breaking point. I laid it out for him plainly. "You've got 2 options. Either start paying rent and utilities or pack your things and leave." He shot back, "Fine," and stormed out. We figured he'd start job hunting, but no. He went right back to his usual routine like nothing had changed. I told him he had 30 days to find work and start contributing. But it was like he believed he had forever. The month passed. Nothing changed. I asked if he had found a job. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Nope." I said, "Then it's time to go." He stared at me, stunned. "You're kicking me out?" I replied, "I'm giving you a choice. You're an adult now. If you're not going to pull your weight in this house, you can't live here." That's when he lost it. "You're not even my real dad. You can't tell me what to do." I stayed calm. "Maybe not by blood, but I'm the one who's kept a roof over your head and food on your plate. I've done my part. Now it's your turn. Step up or step out." He stormed out, slamming the doors behind him as he went. A short while later, he gathered his belongings and left the house without a word, not even a goodbye to Kira. Naturally, she was devastated. She cried for days, and while I did my best to be there for her, deep down I knew we had made the right call. We couldn't keep letting him get away with that kind of behavior. It was time he learned what accountability looked like. But during one of our more emotional talks, Kira said something that really caught me off guard. "I wish I had left with him," she confessed. I asked her what she meant, and she explained, "I know what he did wasn't okay, but he's still my son. He's young, and I just can't stop worrying about him. He won't answer my calls, and I don't even know if he's safe." Hearing that broke something in me. I hadn't expected her to say that. I get it. Jill is her child, and of course that bond runs deep. But I really thought we were on the same page when it came to setting boundaries and teaching him consequences. I know this is painful for her, but having him under our roof had become a constant struggle. Am I really wrong for taking a stand? So here's what's happened since. After that night, things between Kira and me grew tense. The silence in our home became a daily presence. We barely spoke for over a week. Ellie did her best to stay out of it, burying herself in schoolwork and spending more time in her room. But I knew she could feel the tension too. Eventually, I reached my breaking point. I needed to hear where Kira truly stood. I asked her, plain and simple, if she wanted to leave me and go be with Jill. Her eyes were puffy and red when she looked at me. She said, "I honestly don't know. I love you, but Jill is my son. I can't just walk away from him." I explained, "I'm not asking you to abandon him. I'm saying he needs to be held accountable. If you keep rescuing him, he'll never learn to stand on his own." She agreed with me, at least in theory. She admitted I was right, but that didn't make things any easier for her. Jill is her only child, and when it comes to your kids, sometimes it's hard to see clearly through the emotions. I understood her pain, even if I didn't agree with how she wanted to respond to it. I don't have it in me to beg Jill to come back. If he ever shows up on his own and takes responsibility for what he's done, maybe we could figure something out. But until then, I'm not moving an inch. He has to meet us halfway. And from the way he left, I doubt that's happening anytime soon. It's been a few months since everything unfolded. After several failed attempts to reach out, Jill finally replied to Kira. He let her know that he's been staying on friends' couches in the neighboring town. He hasn't owned up to his behavior yet, but at least he's taken some responsibility by getting a part-time job. That, in itself, is a step in the right direction. Ellie, on the other hand, has started to breathe easier. Without Jill in the house, she seems lighter, more relaxed. She's no longer walking on eggshells, constantly bracing herself for his next outburst. Just a few days ago, she told us she's thinking about going back to her tennis classes. Hearing that made my heart swell with cautious hope. As for Kira and me, we're still navigating the aftershocks. I love her deeply, and I truly hope she'll eventually understand that withholding Jill's tuition wasn't out of cruelty. It was an attempt to wake him up before he derailed his future entirely. Cutting him off financially was a difficult decision, but one I felt was necessary to teach him about accountability. I know it's been painful for Kira, especially with how close she is to her son, but the enabling had to stop. The hardest part of parenting is knowing when to step back and let consequences take root. We both care about Jill. We want him to grow into someone responsible and respectful. It's just incredibly difficult when he won't recognize the harm he's caused. Still, I'm hopeful this space and time apart might eventually lead to growth. For him, for Ellie, and for us. Here's to rebuilding one day at a time.